Good evening and welcome back to The Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries here in rainy, sunny, depending, take your choice, Latonia. Before we start today, a couple of things I should mention. Those of you who watched last week's program, and hope all of you did, will notice it was a little bit different, especially from the technical aspect, than today's program. Well, that's because of two reasons. First of all, we have our full team tonight, our three techies in there, all doing whatever techies do, and we were missing one last week. And then we had a computer glitch, which wiped out some of the stuff we were using, so we were kind of in a rather basic mode. Tonight we're back up to our all singing, all dancing, green screen, special effects, all that, except I hope they're not going to do any of that, because I didn't ask for it tonight. The second thing is somewhat ironic. You know, I sit here before the program starts for something like, 10, 15 minutes, while they run in and out and make minute adjustments to the cameras and do this sort of thing, because as a general rule, we don't have a spare camera person in here in the studio with us. It's all done automatically from the control room. And I look up and I'm looking at these two cameras and they're relatively close together. And for the life of me, it reminded me either of two Daleks or two Triffids in lockstep together. Now, if you don't know what a Dalek is, or you don't know what a Triffid is, you're obviously not a science fiction fan. You'll have to look it up on the internet or YouTube or something like that. But anyway, they've got these two things staring at me with unblinking, impersonal gazes. It's quite unnerving, let me tell you. So, we've had an interesting couple of weeks here. We've had some time off, as I told you before, last week. A little bit of downtime and also some time to get some preparatory work done. And an interesting thing is you hear me say on this program how many times we have mechanical glitches and things that go wrong before the program. But if you'd have come to this church this last Sunday, you would have found us worshipping in the chapel, which is a lovely place. But at 8 o'clock in the morning, we come in and find no air conditioning on in the church. Something tripped or everything. So it's like 85 degrees in the sanctuary. And so we have to move all our equipment into the chapel at a moment's notice. And the chapel's not wired for this sort of stuff. So it was an interesting experience of how much can be achieved by a small group of dedicated people when they really put their mind to it. And I'll pay them the compliment because they did an excellent job on Sunday. And then, of course, since we don't have a direct connection to the control room, we have to record it onto the camera's memory cards and then take the memory cards home and put it together and add all the bits and pieces at home or somebody's computer, and still get it to the Community Production Center on Monday, ready for it to go out during the week. It was an interesting couple of days, and I'm so glad I've got this great team that works so well together. Okay, we're in Capernaum. We're talking about Capernaum. If you remember last week, I mentioned that I left Capernaum till last because, after all, despite how little it gets talked about these days, it's mentioned quite frequently in the Bible, of course, it is where Jesus started his earthly ministry. Now, you know, it's very interesting to read about Jesus, what little we have about him growing up. And, of course, there's lots of legends and stories about it, but we know about the Festival of Weeks or the booths and him being in the temple, but we don't really have very much about his youthful life until he starts the ministry, which basically, if you want to be definitive about it, was when he turned the water to wine at the wedding. But really, where Jesus makes a statement like, okay, I'm here, and here's where we start, was in the synagogue at Capernaum, where he read from Isaiah and then said, and in front of you, in your hearing today, this prophecy has come true. Of course, they did what any self-respecting, dyed-in-the-wool, fundamentalist religious organization would do, and that's they ran him out of town, try and throw him over a cliff. Nobody likes change, and nobody likes to hear that, maybe we're doing it wrong. Then or now. Okay, so we're going to finish up this week with Capernaum, not because there's not much to talk about, but I really wanted to give you a background to the city where it all started, or the town where it all started. And then next week we'll be back on, to be honest, I haven't made my mind up yet, but we'll be back on what the Bible says in the sense of what does this say and why is it said that way. I did get a suggestion. I've got to share this with you. One of the staff said, you should do a program about biblical euphemisms. And at face value, you think, oh, okay, euphemism, we're using one word instead of another. That might be interesting. Until you realize that the vast majority of euphemisms in the Old Testament and the New, but mostly in the Old, are used where it's in relation to something sexual. And I mean that sincerely. It is. And what it brings home to me, and maybe you don't think of it this way, is that our Bible, our story, our faith story, if you will, especially in the Old Testament, is a very robust story. It's not a picture, it's not a story of princes, and although they're in there, and kings and palaces, although they're in there too. It's a story of ordinary people with ordinary needs, with ordinary desires, with ordinary problems. If you look at Proverbs, I was reading from Proverbs in my Bible study today, most of the Proverbs are not for people who got it made, not for the rich, not for the landowners, not for the princes and the kings and all that. It's for ordinary people struggling to make ends meet, or struggling to lead a good life with all the things going wrong, with unjust taxes maybe, or conquering armies, And if you think how many times Israel, or Palestine, if you want to call it that, over the centuries, Old Testament and New Testament, how many times it has been taken over, pillaged, sacked, rebuilt, taken over, pillaged, sacked, rebuilt. It's amazing how many conflicts have been fought in just that one part of the world. It really, when God chose the Israelites, he did not choose them because they were going to be easy. Far from it. It's amazing, isn't it? Anyway, Capernaum. Where we finished up last week, we were talking about the archaeology, and they're showing a picture of Capernaum behind me there. But and that's another thing. There's not too many pictures of the archaeology that I'm talking about. I looked all over on the internet, didn't find any. We're talking about the way the houses were built and this sort of thing, and if, up to the 4th century, pretty substantial houses. So Capernaum was not, a shanty town. It was a well-built house. And we finished up talking about how the floors of the houses were cobbled, with stone. Now, most places at that time, the floor was dirt. I mean, it was hard-packed dirt, almost like cement, if you will, hard-packed, with usage, but nonetheless dirt. So having cobbled stone floors was a step up. And of course, around the open courtyard was a series of pretty modest rooms, and then the lights shone through the rooms and then into the courtyard. And I made the remark as I was finishing up last week that given the very coarse structure of the walls, remember, just rocks on top of rocks, no mortar or anything like that, there was no second story. And the roof would simply have been like light wooden beams and then thatch, palm leaves, this sort of thing, mixed with mud. And what's interesting about that is that if you remember, we talked about stairs on the outside, concrete built-in stairs, not wooden ones, built-in, taking you up to the roof, because, people hung their laundry up on the roof. People went up on the roof sometimes in the cool of the evening because it was a nice place to sit. And usually there was sort of a parapet around the actual edges where you could do that. But it's kind of how the Bible stories tie in with the archaeology. For example, the healing of the paralytic. Remember the story? Let me quote you. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, let down the bed. Now, as a child, when I read that and had that read to me, I used to think, boy, they took a pickaxe to the slates and they carved through the roof. I mean, you try to get through somebody's roof today, you've got, 2 layers of wood, 3 layers of tile, an attic, soundproofing, whatever, to get through. But all they really had to do was make a hole in the thatch and lower the dam down. And so with the type of construction seen in Capernaum, which ties in with the story, it wouldn't have been difficult to access the ceiling by the courtyard stairs and remove a part of the thing to allow the bed to be dropped down where Jesus is. So, archaeology confirms the Bible story, which is always very nice. And up to about the 4th century, the houses were, as I say, pretty well constructed. And that was at about the time that the synagogue that is now visible, the one that they've dug up and partially restored and that sort of thing, it was built in around the 4th century. And what's interesting about the buildings is that the ones constructed at the founding of the town, the first buildings, continued to be in use right up until the town was abandoned. So it tells you two things. Obviously, they're very frugal people, but I mean, usually what happens is you look at it around you here. It gets old, knock it down, build something else on top of it. People do the same with houses. They've got an old house, they knock it down, build something new. But the houses were so well built that they, in fact, continued to occupy. But they built new houses, obviously, but they continued to occupy them right up until the town was abandoned. So that's a few hundred years. One block of homes, especially, this is kind of interesting, and they called, remember I said the excavators were the Franciscans, because the Franciscans were the people who seemed to be in on everything in those days. They called it the Sacra Insula, or the Holy Insula. And insula refers to a block of homes around a courtyard. And it was found to have a really complex history, this Sacra Insula. It was located between the synagogue and the lakeshore. The significance of that escapes me for the moment, but maybe there was some significance. But it was found near the front of a labyrinth of houses from many different periods. Okay, so there's a lot of building around in that. There was a group of private houses built around the 1st century, which remained in use, as I said earlier, until the early 4th century. But in the 4th century, there was a great transformation of one of the homes. Great transformation. The octagonal church in the middle, they built an octagonal church in the middle of the 5th century. And the excavators concluded that one of the houses in the village had been venerated as the home of Peter the fisherman, because he came from Capernaum, obviously. So, and that had been going since the 1st century. And in fact, they'd built 2 churches over it before then. Beginning, of course, building in the latter half of the 1st century. And this house had very different characteristics compared to the other houses. The rough walls, remember the walls were just rock, rubble? They were reworked and were covered in inscriptions. There was the floor was plastered over the cobbles. And what's really interesting, they found no domestic ceramics, no domestic pots and pans and this sort of thing, but a huge number of lamps, little oil lamp things. And the explanation that was given was that the room was venerated as a religious gathering place for the Christian community. And you can see that. If it had been Peter's house, and we don't know that for sure, but if it had been, then the early church would have venerated it as somewhere special. In the 4th century, however, it acquired quite a new experience. First of all, they built a thick walled enclosure around it, surrounding the whole thing, which was like 98 feet long, the wall, and the sides were plastered up to a height of 8 feet. And although there was evidence that some of the private houses within the wall had been remained in use after this transformation, the one particular room that had been treated differently, the one I was telling you about, was profoundly altered and expanded and made into what looks like a worship centre. And this whole structure remained until about the 5th century. In the 5th century, they dismantled the whole thing and put a large basilica on it. And The Byzantines did this, okay? And what's interesting, when they constructed their new church, and a Byzantine church had this central octagon. You've seen them, some modern churches like that, Greek Orthodox churches around. They have this sort of octagon-shaped tower in the center. They placed the octagon directly on top of the walls of Peter's house, with the idea of, I suppose, retaining its, or preserving its exact location. Although none of the original house was then visible any longer, because they'd torn it down, and the whole floor was covered in mosaics, so you couldn't see where the floor was. Anyway, the synagogue there in Capernaum appears to have been built about the 4th or 5th century AD, okay? But beneath the foundation of the current synagogue, which in fact exists today, lies another foundation made of basalt rock. And it is thought that was the foundation of the synagogue from the 1st century. If it is, since they didn't knock down synagogues as a general rule hardly ever, they just built on top of them, it's perhaps the one mentioned in the Gospels. In other words, the one that Jesus actually preached in. The old one, in fact, they found a couple of inscriptions in Greek and the other one in Aramaic, and people were going all agog because this might say, oh, this was the synagogue Jesus preached in, or what have you. But no, it's thanking the benefactors who helped with building it. Okay? But it is considered to be the synagogue where Jesus read from the scroll. And for me, one of the things I love when I do the studies for these Bible programs is the fact that you can find something that exists and tie it into something the Bible talks about. Now, I know we have a religion based on faith, and we take things on faith, but it's really, really reassuring and comforting sometimes to have something pop up that shows the two connections, okay? The other interesting thing about Capernaum, and trying to get this in before we close out the program today, in 1986, the water of the lake, okay, Lake Galilee, Sea of Galilee, incidentally, it is, there's 25 different types of fish you can get in that lake, some of which aren't found anywhere else in the world. It's quite amazing. Anyway, it reached a low point. There was a drought and not enough rain, and the water receded. It's not a very deep lake, not hundreds of feet deep, but the water receded, and they found in the mud an ancient fishing boat. Okay? Now, I've got to be careful what I say here because people misconstrue it. Radiocarbon dating, which I believe is a valid science and a valid way of dating things, despite what the answers in Genesis people say. The radiocarbon dating of the wood points to it being anywhere between 120 BC and 40 AD, so 160 years. And it's not that accurate as we know, but somewhere in that period of time. Okay, whilst the pottery found in the boat or near the boat, presumably in it when it sank, can be dated from about 100 BC to 200 AD, it's even wider spread. So it's a boat that probably was around at the time Jesus commenced his ministry and called Simon and James and John and all the others to come and work with him. It's likely that the boat was built of reused timbers. What you did back then is if a boat got so old and leaky, you couldn't cork it anymore, it just wasn't any good. You took it up on the beach, you took it apart, and then you either used the timbers to repair other boats or you built another boat using the timbers that you had plus some new ones. Bear in mind, as I said last week, it wasn't then, nor is it now, an area where you had vast forests of trees suitable for making planks for boats. As an aside, I mentioned in one of my programs last year, I think, when we talk about Joseph the carpenter, in fact, Joseph probably worked in stone much more than he did in wood, because wood was a very rare, not rare, expensive commodity, and most people's bowls and plates and pounding implements were made of stone. So it's very possible Joseph was a stonemaker and a carpenter. Probably was. So they after they look at all this, you know, the boat and the wood and everything else, the established date, or when they think it was around, was 1st century A.D. Boom, bingo. When was Jesus around? 1st century A.D. It was about 20 odd feet long, which is not very big. Okay, wouldn't raise anyone's eyebrows today. It'd be much more than a rowing boat. But it was preserved in the mud of the lake, which had allowed, you know, the wood had not rotted away. So not only could you see the boat, and I've seen pictures of it, and most of it is intact, but it was very difficult to get it out without doing any, you know, the thing when you dig something up, as long as it's held by the mud, it holds together, but when you start separating it, it all falls apart. Well, it didn't. But anyway, the boat is actually on display, and it's called the Sea of Galilee boat. But the point is that it was in use at around the time Jesus was in Capernaum and starting his ministry. And it's, one shouldn't do this, I suppose, but if you want to have dreams of fancy or just let your mind wander, mine does too often, but if let your mind wander, you know, it could have been the boat that Peter and his brother were in. It could have been the boat that they were in when the waves started to swamp them and Jesus walked on the water. It could have been the boat that they were in when they found Jesus on the side of the lake with the breakfast already cooking. I mean, it could. The point is that it all ties in together. And fishing and boats spend a lot of time in Jesus' stories. I mean, he talks about being fishers of men. So it's pretty obvious that Capernaum and its industry, the fishing industry as it was, had a lot to do with the way Jesus phrased his stories. I mean, if you're in a fishing town and you're trying to make a point, it's a lot easier to talk about fishers of men than ploughers of the field, because nobody was doing that. It just becomes more interesting. Anyway, so that's Capernaum. The last of our cities. It is also the place where I think Jesus spent more time in Capernaum than anywhere else, other than his growing up years. Okay, so it is important. It does have a fairly active tourist trade now. It's one of those places on my bucket list whenever I get around to it. But it featured greatly, Capernaum featured greatly in the key points of Jesus' earthly ministry. So it's worth thinking. So whilst it's the last of the town, cities we're talking about in the Bible, it is maybe the most important. I mean, Jerusalem is important because of the key events it took there, but Jesus really didn't have much influence in Jerusalem until those last few days. So we've looked at a lot of the cities of the Bible. We've talked about some of them have gone forever, disappeared. Some of them are still there. Some of them are moved a mile up the road, this sort of thing. Jerusalem, of course, is still there. Bethlehem, Nazareth, they're all still there. But Capernaum is one of those ones that somehow or other seems to slip out of sight. You know, people can say, oh, I've been to Nazareth, I've been to Bethlehem, been to Capernaum. No, we didn't go that far. You know, because they're all around Jerusalem. Capernaum's way up north, okay? So, that's it for the cities of the Bible. If you've been following the whole series through, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed doing it. There are, of course, many, many other cities we could go to, but we could be doing this all year. and I'd like to get back into some more searching, shall we say, religious questions, shall we? Okay. But at least in these little travel logs, you've got a better understanding of the background, where these things happened. And sometimes with the Bible, if you understand where it took place and you understand what was happening at the time, it makes it a lot easier to understand. I mean, it really does. Sometimes, you read the Bible thing, well, what was all that about? But then you realize, oh, that's why they did this and this and this. Okay, so tune in next week, and by then, hopefully, I'll have figured out our next series for my 5 or 6 different scripts I've got going, and we'll let it be a surprise to you, okay? Until then, don't forget to watch our sister program, The Sunshine Club, which is coming back online in a few weeks with a new series. We've been running repeats for a while because of logistic problems, but that's coming back on. And always tune into The Bible Speaks, okay? And keep your Bible handy and read it daily. Good night. God bless.